Okay, welcome everyone to this session. We are really looking forward for this talk by Professor Niva Elkin-Koren, who is a professor of law at Tel Aviv University, Faculty of Law, and a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. She was the founding director of the Center for Cyber Law and Policy and of the Haifa Center for Law and Technology. So without further ado, I will let Niva go on with her talk. Thank you for accepting the invitation once again.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm actually, I was really impressed from what I could learn from your website that this is a very interdisciplinary environment, and so I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm a law professor, and I've been studying intellectual property and law and technology for 2 decades, and over the past couple of years I've been focusing on the way we govern behavior by algorithms. And so the wider context is that in this era, many judicial and semi-judicial decisions are increasingly being automated and assigned to machine learning systems. We see that in predicting policing, that is assisting police to identify potential suspect. We see that in risk assessment systems that are consulting judges on potential risks of offenders, or during punishment decisions. We see that in systems that are distributing social welfare benefits or detecting fraud. And we also see that, and maybe that was actually one of the first examples where we have seen judicial and semi-judicial decisions that are being made by machine learning system in the context of filtering systems and systems that are enforcing speech restrictions, especially in the context of copyright law. That is how I became interested in this area. So governing behavior by design is nothing new, and at least over the past 3 decades, we've discussed this I guess since the 90s, where legal scholars like Joel Reidenberg were discussing how algorithms could actually substitute for some governing measures, legal measure, and shape behavior. Later on, Professor Larry Lessig from Harvard actually developed this concept of code as law, putting the design in the context of other regulatory mechanisms such as market mechanisms, social norms, and legal norms as an additional force that is shaping and affecting behavior. And my own interest is to actually look at machine learning systems and explore the way they change how we govern behavior. So is there a difference between the way we govern behavior by rules or legal norms and the way we govern behavior by algorithms? But more so, in the context of machine learning system, my main interest is how the fact that we are shifting from rule-based algorithms to machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence is actually changing the regulatory scene where we are all make actions and try to regulate behavior. And so the test case that I'm going to use in this presentation for the purpose of demonstrating some of the issues is the filtering of allegedly infringing copyrighted materials by AI and machine learning systems. And the question that I'd like to tackle is how we govern by legal norms, like copyright norms, then look at the way we govern by filtering, by machine learning systems, to point out some concerns and to propose some interventions that might be addressing these concerns in that context. And so when we think of copyright, just to for a start, this is taken from the US copyright law. But just to give the legal context, when we regulate by norms, we have norms that define what is right and what is wrong, and who has a right and under which circumstances. So in this context, we have a copyright law that is defining the exclusive rights of the copyright owner, for instance, the exclusive right to reproduce the work or to make a copy. And the law also defined that this exclusive right applies when there is substantial similarity between the original copy and the allegedly infringing copy. The law also says that in some cases that are considered fair use, even though there was the action of copying an original work of authorship that is protected by copyright without authorization of the copyright owner, that would not be considered an infringement. And that is when that use, for instance, in some circumstances for educational purposes or for the purpose of criticism or parody, in these cases, this would not be considered a copyright infringement when it constitutes fair use. And fair use will be determined, as you can see, by courts considering four factors: the purpose and character of the use, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality and the portion that was copied or taken from the original work, and the effect of this copying on the market value of the copyrighted work. So this is the legal regime. And the question is what happens as we shift to governance by algorithms. And just to back up a little bit and see how this legal regime or this environment where we have algorithms governing the copyright infringement online has emerged. Let's just take a look at the legal context. And so in the online environment where we have a communication structure of, when we shifted from a communication structure of one to many, like in broadcast or in publishing or in or where we had newspapers, into an environment where everyone can upload and share with millions of users any content online, first in a distributed internet, and then through on social media, mediated by these big five companies. We have an ecosystem where users can exchange content. Some of it is legal and, of course, contributes to some fruitful social interaction and has some political significance. And some of it is illegal and contaminating the public discourse, and illegal by being hate speech, illegal by being incitement to terrorism being illegal by being copyright infringement. And basically, the legal regime that is governing this exchange of content is, through the 90s and up until recently, has been governed by this principle of notice and takedown. That is the platform that is enabling users to exchange content is not liable for content unless it has knowledge about the harmful content or the infringing content in the context of copyright. That was basically the rule in the United States. It's still the rule in the United States with respect to copyright. And it was basically also the rule in Europe and in other countries. Users themselves could be held accountable for the harmful content that they're exchanging, whereas platform will become accountable only if they fail to act after they received a notice. This notice and takedown, as a research show, quickly turned into robotic exchange, and that is due to the volume of notices that had to be handled by social media platform, by search engines, by hosting facilities, even by ISPs. And so rather than having a notice being sent by a user that found themselves that found their rights infringed online, we have crawlers that are actually crawling the net, identifying potentially infringing materials, and often robotically notifying social media, such as a search engine or a social media platform, and they automatically remove these URLs or postings that are allegedly infringing until further dispute. This in the United States, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act actually provides a lot of details regarding this procedure. And so, in fact, even based on some reports, and that is an old report, relatively like 2 years ago, maybe, by Facebook itself, when you look at the removal of harmful content, widely defined, not just copyright infringement, but all sorts of content, you can see that in some contexts, like in terrorist propaganda or in hate speech, there are very large percentages of content that are just being removed automatically, algorithmically, without any human being reviewing them. And on top of it, in the context of copyright, especially in Europe, the recent copyright directive, the Digital Single Market Directive, Article 17, is actually providing incentives to particular major online content sharing services, such as YouTube and Facebook, to undertake technical measures to install filters against the exchange of the uploading of copyright infringing materials. Otherwise, they could be held responsible, actually directly, strictly liable to copyright infringement. That is, of course, unless they acquired a license. And so this is a background. And now the question is, what is governance by AI in this context? And so I think that the basic point is that we don't know. And the reason is that all of these systems that are filtering content, that are using machine learning systems, machine learning capabilities in order to identify potentially infringing materials and then filter them out either at the outset or retrospectively after they've been uploaded to the system. Most of them are proprietary systems that are kept secret by their providers. But still, we know on some of these systems, for instance, in Scribe, that is a hosting facility for books, audiobooks, and digital books, where publishers could upload their books to provide these services of sharing the books for a fee or with subscribers. This a hosting facility is using Book ID, and that is a system with a particular digital ID for each book that is able to detect infringing copies. Flickr is using AI in order to detect infringing pictures. Amazon Project Zero is using AI in order to detect counterfeits and the misuse of brands that are owned by some property owners. Some systems are even or some researchers are even proposing to detect to predict the live streaming of videos based on an analysis of some chat rooms that are discussing the future upload or stream of sports games or other live streaming. And of course, the most interesting system and probably the most advanced is Content ID by YouTube. It is a proprietary system by YouTube that basically is a database of digital ID files of original content. The system is using these content IDs, these hashtags of protected works to find a match on any uploaded material. So this is an upload filter that can filter out, can prevent you from uploading videos that contain works that are protected by or signaled by content ID. And it also crawls the hosting facility of YouTube, the servers of YouTube, to make sure that existing files do not contain any content ID. Now, Content ID system enables Content ID owners, those who claim rights in these original works, to actually make a choice of how to treat these works that are being detected by the system. They can either block such work or monetize it, namely enable some advertising on these videos, or track the viewership statistics and share this valuable data with YouTube. The choice is the choice of these owners. What is interesting is actually that YouTube is now offering another service, and that is the check service to enable users who want to upload a video. Let's say you're an independent um, musician and you want to make sure that your video actually complies with Content ID and that there are no counterclaims by anyone on the video that you intend to upload. You can use the check service, and that would spot for you the ways in which your remix video or original music may trigger some Content ID claims, and then enable you to also correct and adjust that video so it would comply with Content ID requirements. So what we are seeing actually, and that is really interesting in the context of content ID that is being used by YouTube, are two different legal regimes. One is a regime that is enforcing copyright, where we have the notice and takedown, even though that is algorithmic, right? And so that uh, and copyright owner can actually issue a notice saying, YouTube, there is an infringing copy of my video or my music clip on your servers, please remove it. And that would be the copyright takedown system. Whereas parallel to that and simultaneously, we also have the content ID service which enable people to claim the rights using content ID. And based on the reports of YouTube, this most people are actually using. That is the most scalable service that now YouTube is providing compared to the regular common notice and takedown that is governed by and comply with copyright law. And so basically what makes this, how this the system is working is that a user is providing some input, like a video, a music clip. It is being uploaded. The platform is using either content ID or some notice or is updating some notices regarding particular work that has been issued by right holders, or in other cases not related to copyright, could be by governments. That is enabling the system to screen out, some materials if there is a match with the content idea or with other hashtags of harmful content. And if there is no match, the content remains online. Once there is a match, system is taking some action, either removing the content, the restricting access to the content, blocking, monetizing it in the way I've described before. And what is interesting about these systems is that they also learn. That what makes a machine learning system. So you can learn how to remove a particular photo or a particular music composition, but the system also learn to detect something that is really similar to that content, and even if it is a little bit different, it may learn to detect it and remove it. What we see, what is really typical of this system is this feedback loop that is learning from experience. So the more we learn to identify particular type of content, the better we get in identifying it or similar content to it. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And so what are the concerns about this type of system? One set of concerns is that it may change the balance of copyright law, that on the one hand want to protect the rights of right holders, and at the same time also want to promote other important values such as fair use, freedom of speech, etc. And so one example that has been reported by the Electronic Freedom Foundation is really interesting, and that is like 10 hours of white noise, which is simply musical or notes that are being played in and frequencies are being played in different intensities. So 10 hours of white noise were tackled by 5 strike down claims of content ID. Another example is a public report by the American government that is being removed as being a copyright infringement, even though it's in the public domain. A more classic example is a video, a little lens playing, dancing to at the background. There is a music that is copyrighted, and it is a use that has been held by the American court as fair use. Nonetheless, it is being removed as infringing. Some educational materials, like music that is being used in lessons online for teaching guitar or in copyright classes, all of these are errors that where copyright law would have, if this would have come to a court, the court would have decided to keep it online, but the machine erroneously is removing it. Now, the technical mechanism, of course, enables error, like also any judicial errors that we could see in courts. Nevertheless, it is more difficult to contest such errors. One of the reasons is that people who want to contest content ID claim on YouTube are risking copyright liability and may have to sometimes address some of the or expose themselves to some financial harms or reputational harms that involve potential blocking by YouTube. Again, we can come back to that during the Q&A. But what I really want to highlight is another type of concerns. Mistakes we have also in courts. We've seen that it is more difficult to address errors in the context of algorithmic decision making. But I guess what makes machine learning in that context different than decisions by court is that the scale is much larger, right? Once there is an error, it really affects a lot of users and potentially could make removal easier for content that is actually affected by this error in the filter. Whereas in court, we have judicial decisions that are being made on an incremental basis. The other type of or set of concerns that I want to highlight are more systematic. And one has to do with the fact, as in the context of content ID, for instance, that is a private type of enforcement system. And not everyone qualifies for this system. Content ID is something to which you need to qualify, and not everyone can use that system. So some people are eligible for that, like big corporations that hold large portfolios of copyrighted materials. But what about independent creators? What is really interesting is that you see, for instance, this class action that was filed last year by Maria Schneider against YouTube, claiming that it is biased towards large portfolios, and it does not enforce the copyright of independent creators in the same way. Now, another interesting aspect of this litigation is that is actually relevant to many other claims that we may have against algorithmic enforcement by social media platforms, is that for Maria Schneider to actually prove her this type of bias, it's really difficult. YouTube is claiming that there is no evidence that there is bias, right, or discrimination in the way it enforces copyright, the regular copyright of independent creators, and the use of by Content ID by large portfolios. But in order to prove that, you need access to their data. And so for Maria Schneider to be able to actually prove her claim in court, she has to gain some access to data that is proprietary and is now being held as private and secret data governed by YouTube. Which leads to, I think, another aspect that has to be taken into consideration, and that is the way in which, for YouTube, Content Idea is basically part of their business model and enable them to share profits with some copyright holders, which makes you wonder whether a single system that is using the same principle for determining what is considered data and determining what is considered copyright infringement, what is considered a match between an original copyrighted work and a copy, what is considered a copy, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 minutes, how similar it has to be. The same system that makes all of these determinations is making something, is actually performing a function that is a public function, that is a law enforcement function related to copyright. And at the same time is also doing some other works, such as curating the content for users, like determining what would be on the recommendation system for viewers of YouTube, what should they view next, and also moderating between copyright holders and potential infringers or on YouTube. So you see the same infrastructure that is being managed by a machine learning system provide different functions that may be in conflict with one another. And going back to that slide and the feedback loop that I've showed you before, if you have Content ID, if you're eligible to Content ID and you can provide the system with Content ID, the system learn how to identify your content better than the content of people without Content ID. Because it just do it a lot, right? And it learns from experience. That's what makes it machine learning. And so this is something that by design is creating some bias towards strategic players such as copyright holders or governments in some cases of hate speech or what is considered by governments as terrorist speech, to the extent that they get to have more impact on what the system is learning. And so when we think of it from a more theoretical perspective, this privatized enforcement is actually turning into rulemaking, because what we see is actually a system such as YouTube creating norms that are affected both by the definition that are provided by YouTube itself, and also is shaped by the behavior of strategic players that are affecting the input of machine learning systems and could tilt them towards particular directions. And so if we compare governance by law to governance by AI, we see that in law, as I showed you before, in copyright law, the norms are explicit. In governance by AI, We don't know what the norms are. We don't know what is considered, for instance, similar, right? We don't have a court to interpret this. The norms are being decided in law by deliberation through the parliament or through the court. Courts require to justify their decision making. In governance by AI, such as in YouTube, we have probabilistic a decision-making process, where the system actually predict that the work that I've uploaded to YouTube is similar in some probabilistic way to other work, to the work that is defined as copyrighted by the content ID system. When we look at the trade-offs that the court has, the law has to make between access to copyrighted materials and protection of copyrighted materials to protect the interest of copyright owners, these trade-offs by law are explicit and transparent. We know what the rights are, and we know what the limitations on the rights are. In governance by AI, these are concealed, the trade-off is concealed through the optimization function of the system. I see some letters here actually jumped, so it's hard to look at this slide, but let me just say that in terms of ownership, we've seen that governance by law is governed by public entities, and governance by AI is often privatized. What is lost in translation is that the scope of filtering, or in some cases censorship, is unknown. The rules are non-transparent. Sometimes there are biases that are not held accountable because we don't have any way of proving them. The trade-offs that are really important are not being deliberated upon and are being concealed in the optimizing functions. And overall, we have a less pluralist system because we don't have enough opportunities for contesting the way in which the system makes decisions. And so how do we restore copyright balance? And of course, for those of you interested in other contexts like free speech and in the context of disinformation, harmful content, etc., the question is how to restore the public balance in these areas. And so there are many proposals to create more transparency on the way in which these systems are working. And so the requirement for transparency reports led to a lot of reports that are being published by social media platforms, but they tell us very little about the actual decisions that are being made. And so we know less about these decisions than we wanted to know, or we were able to know when we were governed by legal norms. There is, of course, the possibility of self-regulation, and that the oversight board of Facebook is one example to that. But my proposal in the paper Contesting Algorithms that I've published last year is actually to look for design solutions and to reimagine the design of machine learning systems in a way that will introduce some interventions into the decision-making process that would introduce digital checks and balances, where in democracies we often have checks and balances in the way government is structured, through separation of powers, through the principle of the rule of law, through the different civil rights to which we are all entitled. we need to look for similar checks and balances, not in using these old tools, but thinking of how we can introduce them into the design of the system. And here I'm trying to build on a concept of adversary that is really important in law, where we have plaintiff and defendants that are arguing before a court. But it is also really useful in computer science, where adversary is sometimes being used in order to create, to check resilience, or to create to introduce some oversight to the system. And so one proposal is actually to introduce a system that would actually automatically oversight the decision making by platforms, where we would require platforms such as YouTube and Facebook to run their decisions, the removal decisions, through what I call a public AI system. That doesn't have to be a system that is created necessarily by the government. It could be different systems, actually, that could be introduced by civil society actors. But the idea here is actually to require platforms that before removal will run these removal decisions through an independent system that would consider, would reflect different considerations. The advantages is that we will receive more data about removal decisions that would enable us to introduce more oversight. The other advantage is that such design would enable us to actually make these decisions and the decision itself more visible. So if we have a decision by the platform like YouTube that a particular content is allegedly infringing, and the YouTube content ID decides to remove it because there is a match to some original work. And when you run it on an independent AI system, it turns out that there is no match, then we have a dispute. And if we can have different ways of addressing this dispute, either through by human review. We can actually defer it to a human judge or a human arbitrator, or we can have some computational social norms that would decide these disputes. But one way or another, this is no longer a decision of the platform alone, but there is a design that enables us to actually introduce more independent social voices into the decision of what content become available to all of us. And so I want to actually provide another example and then conclude so we can have some discussion. Just to say that on this particular design intervention actually enables us to move from a monolithic decision making by the platform to a more pluralistic decision making by a system that is changing over time. Whereas courts and judicial intervention would be something that is, an intervention that might be too slow and less effective, cannot work at scale as we want in this environment. The other demonstration for this design-based intervention that I want to share with you is the idea of separation of functions. If we had in government separation of powers, the legislator, the judiciary, and the executive branch are separated, and they actually compete with one another, thus balancing one another's power. The idea that I proposed here with my colleague Mayan Pearl is actually to introduce separation of functions and actually separate the enforcement function from the duties of platforms, requiring them to enable independent programs to work on their data to identify the potentially infringing materials. And so that platforms would not actually perform these two roles, but would would be required to actually enable access to independent programs. And so the idea behind these interventions that I've just demonstrated, and there are actually other ideas along these lines, is to create some friction, disruptive friction, into the way machine learning are working or operating in order to enable more oversight, more public oversight, but potentially more judicial oversight over what private system of decision making are doing using machine learning. And so if you think of road bumpers as a way of slowing down the traffic, disruptive friction is actually a design intervention in a similar sense that is actually introduced in order to maintain our freedom, in order to make sure that the system is not optimizing goals without providing us with any tools that would enable public oversight over these robust decision-making systems. And so if you want to learn more about these ideas, these are the 3 papers on which this presentation has been based, and I'll be happy to stop here and address your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niva. So now we'll be stopping the recording and let you ask any questions.